The last phase of our talks today is going to get into soil-water aspen relations. Our next speaker is Scott Jones. He's an associate professor in the Department of Plant Soils and Climate at USU here. His area of research and teaching is environmental soil physics and unsaturated transport in soil. So, Scott.
Thank you, Paul. And thanks for the invitation to speak to you. I'm involved in several projects that have ties between soils and, in this case, forest ecosystems. And this presentation is going to cover basically two components of that work. And the first one is tied to a drought management initiative that began funding about 4 or 5 years ago. And part of that project was to add instrumentation at the TWDEF Experimental Forest. And I know many of you are familiar with this forest, probably more so than I am. Our study site is very small in scale, so I'm referring to the instrumented site when I talk about this. The other part of my presentation today will look at different ways that we can, look into the subsurface and understand soil properties and those properties related to processes. So I'll try to talk about some of these measurements and specifically applying those to issues with aspen. The TWDEF Experimental Forest is located up Logan Canyon. If you're familiar with where that is, traveling up the canyon, just as you get to the summit here, the Sinks Road heads this way. And about 6 miles down that road, there's a gate there, and there's a sign now that designates this instrumented site. We've been fortunate in working with Campbell Scientific to be able to get radio communication from Campbell Scientific to Logan Peak, where you have this massive tower, lots of instrumentation, communication instrumentation there. And then we've got line of sight to the top of our site. So we can actually communicate with data loggers, see where problems are, and that's very nice, especially in the wintertime when access is difficult. One of the other features that the site has now, in July 2007, instrumentation was added through the USDA Snotel system, and they located a site here just on the southwest side of our site in a clearing. So there we have a snow rain gauge for year-round precipitation. There's a snow pillow adjacent to that. And then they have their soil moisture monitoring system also there. So this is the USU Doc Daniel Snotel site. If you go to the Snotel website, you can see that. And so this is the first year of full data that we have. There's about 1 meter of moisture that fell there so far this year. So this sensor network came about, I think, a year or two after Helge von Meegroot and Janice Bettinger and Michelle Baker had gone in and established some sites for a carbon study that they were interested in doing. So the instrumentation went in the pre-existing vegetation plots, had aspen, conifer, grassiforb, and sage sites established there. So they put in 3 replicate sites for each vegetation type, and then at each site they had 3 treatments. And they had plans to have a control site, supplemental water application through irrigation, and then a snow melt site for drought simulation. I don't know if any of you have tried to melt snow and you have 10 feet of snow in a site. I don't think they've been successful at doing that yet, but those are the 3 treatments that they had planned. Now, in terms of the instrumentation, this was a very large-scale effort, and It started with the 12 instrumented sites. An eddy flux tower was added later on, where you get measurements of carbon dioxide, water vapor, solar radiation, and wind speed and direction, as well as temperature measurements. In the 12 study sites, the measurements that are there, there's atmospheric measurements, snow depth measured at each site, net radiation, and air temperature. And then in terms of subsurface measurements, initially there were soil moisture measurements using TDR. They had soil temperature measurements, and also soil tensiometers were installed. And in all of these cases, there were a lot of problems and really didn't get much useful measurements in the last few years. So this year we've gone in and replaced those sensors now. So we do have soil moisture, matrix potential, electrical conductivity, and temperature at 3 depths. And now these are measured in each of the 3 replicate plots at each of the 12 sites. So there's a fair bit more subsurface measurements going on now. This is a zoomed in view of the site, and basically shows the distribution in vegetation. The green is the aspen here, here, and here. You have sage on top of the site and then down lower. There's grassiforb in the red areas here, and then the conifers primarily on this end of the site here. So you have those distributions of vegetation, about 400 meters long and 200 meters wide here, with our eddy flux tower right here in the center. The radio tower is up here on top, and that transmits data to Logan Peak and then down to Campbell Scientific. And we can access their data logger there through the internet, so we can access the data real time. One of the other things that we did here was we put a fence to keep out cattle and sheep in the summertime. This fence is only about 4 feet tall, so it doesn't keep out the native wildlife. Now, a bit more regarding the subsurface monitoring. You can see looking up this is upslope here, the radio tower is up on top, and then you can see some of the individual sites here with the snow depth sensor. The ribbons here are outlining each of the different treatment plots. And so we've got our water content sensors. In this case, it's an Acclima TDT sensor, as well as a decagon potential, matrix potential sensor installed at 3 depths at each of these plots. So this gives us a pretty good idea of plant water availability down to about 50 centimeters in each of these plots. The sensors themselves have, in the case of the water content sensor, has the full range of water content up to saturation. So I have here the soil volumetric water content and the energy of the water, or the matrix potential. And I'm just showing a curve here for a silt loam soil. Within the site, we run the range from sandy soils to all the way to clay soils. So there's a wide distribution in soil type. But in terms of the energy of the water, we can sense from about 1 meter up to 50 meters of matrix potential. That's about 10 kilopascals up to about 500. So I should say a bit more about this sensor because it's relatively new. They started selling these sensors, I think, in January of this year. So there hasn't been a lot of work in broad characterization of how well these sensors work. But in terms of a range of matrix potential, this is really an advance compared to tensiometers, for example, which would go up to about 10 meters, 8 or 10 meters of suction, and are certainly a lot more work in terms of maintaining those, where they have to be refilled with water when they get too dry and bubble. So what we've done is put these paired sensors in at 3 depths in the soil profile, and from that we'll be able to basically track the matrix potential and water content through this range of wetting and drying. And what that allows us to do with that information, we can fit the water retention curve using a number of water retention models and extrapolate out to where you get to the wilting point in plants. So this should be a big improvement in terms of the soil water holding capacity of soils at the site, as well as when it comes to modeling, we can use this data to inform the model in terms of, especially at the dry end where the soils start to really hold on to the water and the plants have to work much harder to access that water. So again, the instrumentation here was installed for the purpose of understanding the impact of drought on plant species in the mountains of Utah. And what we've achieved is establishing the capability for a long-term database of critical zone measurements from the canopy down into the soil to the rooting depth. These measurements are provided for 4 different vegetation responses, specifically in looking at the soil moisture and also matrix potential within a limited range. And future work will look at modeling the annual soil moisture cycle from these measurements, and hopefully being able to simulate the effects of increasing or decreasing soil moisture, whether that's an effect of drought or climate change where we may have increased moisture in certain areas. So those are the sort of purposes of instrumenting the site, and hopefully some of these measurements will be useful for some of you in your work. Right now we have some of the data online, but we're trying to get that to where we have periodic updates to the website for availability of data. Another aspect of this work is looking at the assessment of snowmelt dynamics and fate of that snow. So there's also work in terms of hydrology going on. So let me turn now towards a topic that I presented at the Ecological Society of America meeting this past month. And some of this work deals now with different instruments that can basically look into the subsurface and tell you something about soil properties that you might be interested in. The hypothesis here is that soil electrical conductivity measurements in forest ecosystems are primarily affected by the soil clay content, and I'll talk about why that is. This is limited to well-leached soils. The objective is to employ electromagnetic induction and electrical resistance imaging of forest soils to inform ecohydrological studies regarding soil spatial properties and processes. So we want to be able to go in and actually map soil properties and basically look at what the changes in soil properties are and how that affects the vegetation and distribution of vegetation. And what I'll try to show is that mapping forest clay content in terms of the soil texture provides an important indicator of the nutrient and water resource availability. So this could be quite valuable for many of the ecological studies that go on in forest systems. Just a brief introduction to this, first of all, the electromagnetic induction measurement. This instrument is about 1 meter long. They do make them longer. It measures the bulk electrical conductivity of the soil, and that's sensitive to the spacing between the 2 coils here, and also to the ratio of the electromagnetic field that is sensed. So you have a transmitter that generates an electromagnetic field. That field propagates down into the soil, and it induces electrical current loops within the soil. those current loops are proportional to the electrical conductivity of the soil. And that in turn generates a secondary electromagnetic field that is sensed by this receiver coil. So you have the primary and the secondary fields showing up here. Okay, now as you hold that instrument over the soil, the electrical field that propagates down into the soil dies off as you go deeper into the soil. For a vertical and vertical coil, I have about 70% of that signal propagating down to about 1.5 meters. Okay? If I orient the receiver coil horizontally, then it propagates not as deep. Okay? So for this application where we carry this instrument across the soil surface, we have to hold it up above the vegetation, generally about 30 to 50 centimeters. So we primarily just use this deeper penetration depth in this case. This second measurement technique is electrical resistance imaging. Basically, you set out an array of electrodes in the soil, and you set up this system so that you impose an electrical current across two outer electrodes, and you measure the voltage across two inner electrodes. And that then tells you something about the electrical resistance, or the inverse would be the electrical conductivity of the soil. And in this case, the electrical conductivity is a function of the spacing between the electrodes and the measured voltage. Okay? So I'll talk about those two measurements, and specifically the electrical conductivity that they sense in the soil. Now there's two aspects. One is a time variant property in the soil. It's a function of water content, which changes, soluble ions, which can vary considerably. Those lead to the electrical conductivity and the temperature. All of these are going to vary in time. There's time invariant properties, such as the soil texture. The clay content doesn't change generally in soils. Cation exchange capacity is fairly stable, as is the sedimentary layering. So when we measure this, the bulk electrical conductivity is a function of the electrical conductivity of the solution, as well as the electrical conductivity of the solid phase. And that's going to be tied primarily to the clay fraction of the soil, because you have absorbed ions on the clay fraction, and they're going to contribute to the electrical conductivity. So if I have a soil that's been well drained, every year you get about a meter of water up there flushing through the soil, the ions are carried away, and so the major contributor to the electrical conductivity is going to be the clay content. So now we went in there with this electromagnetic induction sensor, and basically you walk back and forth through the forest with about 20 to 50 meter spacing, and every second you get a measurement from the GPS and from the instrument. Then you go back with that data and you Krieg the electrical conductivity to generate a soil map here. So what you see is that I have soil electrical conductivity measurements from about 2 up to about 60 across our site here. Well, that tells you an awful lot about the soil properties. First of all, I have a high electrical conductivity here associated with a high clay content, which is associated with a low hydraulic conductivity. So I have low infiltration capacity there, where up here with the sandy soils, lower electrical conductivity, I have high infiltration capacity. And also we can look at the correlation to the clay fraction from some of the pits that were dug as part of the study. You can see here the clay fraction is quite low up here, except for this spot, and quite high down here in these higher clay content soils. The other measurement that we made now, instead of looking at the surface properties, looks at a profile in soil, and it tells us something about the depth of the soil and the electrical conductivity along this transect. And you can see right here that this measures down to about 30 meters, so it's going quite deep in the soil profile. And from this map now we're looking at electrical conductivity, so the inverse of the resistivity. We have a high clay content in this region right here, low electrical conductivity associated with the bedrock here. And I think the key figure here is that we walk along this transect and look at the vegetation along the transect at each of the electrodes within a 2-meter radius. And so what we see is that the conifer tend to dominate the upper end here. We have a mixture of conifer and then aspen dominating this region right here. Grassiforbs are dominant in this region. And what we see is that the aspen community right here is associated with what is a very large soil reservoir for soil moisture in this case. So this is a very interesting finding from these measurements, specifically with regard to aspen. So in summary, I wanted to point out the facilities available at the T.W. Daniel Experimental Forest, providing these critical zone measurements in 4 different vegetation communities. The benefits of the electromagnetic induction mapping in terms of painting a picture of the soil properties, the clay content, which is highly correlated to soil moisture holding capacity, and then the capabilities using electrical resistance imaging in terms of looking deeper in the soil profile. And I think coupling these measurements has some nice potential for understanding soil properties and also processes within the soil for studying these vegetation communities. Just to conclude, I'll point to there's a number of investigators involved with the Drought Management Initiative and also a large number of people that have been involved in this study. Also the funding from USDA. Thank you.
The vegetation soil moisture association, how much of that being driven by vegetation as opposed to physical properties of the soils?
Well, I guess that's a tough question, knowing whether the soils were developed based on the vegetation or if the vegetation came because of the soils. And I'm not sure I can answer that.
Well, I guess corollary to that is if you've got a situation where with advancing succession, so you're getting a decreasing amount of aspen and more conifer, do you expect that the soil properties will change, i.e. the soil moisture, as that transition takes place? Is that one of the take-home messages here?
Well, I think that if you look at the moisture regime under grass and forb, soil moisture storage there is primarily taken up in a shallow depth. So you have a deeper reservoir of moisture that's really not accessed for the most part. When you get into the tree species where the roots go down deeper, then they can draw on those deeper reservoirs. And in this case, what we saw was that this deep profile of clay, which goes down to 10 meters, really provides a much greater soil moisture reservoir than outside of this domain. So at least in this case, it looked like the aspen took advantage of that, and it may be that the clay itself was more difficult for some of the other species to develop in, because it is very high clay content, perhaps more difficult to get established in terms of higher water contents in the springtime.
I wonder if the aspen stand that you're looking at is if you would characterize it as a stable stand, or if it's just that it was disturbed in recent history.
Well, yeah, my background in that area is pretty limited, so I'm not sure I could answer that adequately. There are a number of mature trees in that area, so I don't think there's been fire there for many years, but I'm not sure exactly how to quantify that.
I guess with that question, are you going to take your monitoring to a larger spatial scale and try to look at more mixed data?
Well, this work kind of came about because we were doing similar work in Idaho, in Reynolds Creek. So this is sort of preliminary work, and I know that Ron Ryle has interest in expanding this. So one of his students has been doing some work down in Cedar City using electromagnetic induction. So they're mapping the surface properties to relate those to the clay content.
If there are no further questions, can we give Scott a hand?
Thank you.